Hi, this video is not an ideological challenge. It's not a call to arms bugling for drawn lines and pitched battle. I'm not picking a fight or choosing a side. This is a normal person voicing honest concern about a community that he cares deeply about. Before we can address why I'm so concerned about young Earth creationism, we need to understand what young Earth creationism is. Creationism is a countercultural movement connected to various religions that rejects most of the scholarly consensus in the fields of astronomy, cosmology, geology, biology, archaeology, paleontology, anthropology, and prehistory, along with smaller parts of the consensus in many other fields. Central to young Earth creationism is the belief that the Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and the belief that a global flood dominates Earth's researchable past. Young Earth creationists propose alternative models to those commonly utilized by scientists to describe plate tectonics, geologic strata, the fossil record, radioisotope dating, genetics, epigenetics, taxonomy, and many other phenomena. Keeping that in mind, I want to try to demonstrate something. At the bottom of the geologic column, all across the world, there are several hundred meters of basement rocks, marked by a history of heat and pressure. The only fossils here are traces of microbes, green and blue algae, and stromatolites. So, how would young Earth creationists say these rock layers formed? For argument, I'm going to be using the Institute for Creation Research's flood geology model, as laid out in the books The Global Flood and The Fossil Record, as well as various web articles from their site. The Global Flood describes these rock layers this way, quote, "The only possible fossils in these layers are microscopic, single-celled organisms. These sedimentary layers probably speak of the time during day 3 of Creation Week, when God called the continents up out of the ocean. Great forces were at work, deforming and altering the original created materials as the Creator embellished them into continents, or perhaps one single supercontinent. No life was present then." Did you catch that? Early in that passage, ICR says, quote, "The only fossils in these layers are microscopic, single-celled organisms." But at the end of the passage, they say, quote, "No life was present then." Seeking clarification on this point proves tricky, considering the ICR book titled The Fossil Record doesn't even mention these fossils except in one sentence, and that's despite their significance as, again, the earliest traces of life we have ever found. This is unfortunately the rule, not the exception, with creationist literature. Contradictions abound, and many points, important points, of various fields aren't mentioned at all. I would go so far as to say that most of the features in the stratigraphic sequence aren't addressed at all by the ICR flood geology model. And I'm taking these explanations at face value. If I question the validity of their claims, things get even worse. How exactly does tectonic uplift form rock layers? Well, they don't say. There's not even a cursory mechanism mentioned. This fragmentation within young Earth creationist models comes into focus over and over again. In a passage describing features of sandstone layers, the global flood describes that animal tracks are too fragile and too articulate to survive on dry sand dunes. Quote, "The presence of animal tracks require the sand to have been saturated when it was deposited." But later on in the same paragraph, we are told this, quote, "The height of the dunes sometimes necessitates water velocities at depth to have been several meters per second." So what are they telling us here? First of all, they're saying the footprints on sandstone rock layers are too fragile and too well preserved to have survived the wind conditions on normal dunes. But later, they say that crossbedding on these same sandstone layers was made by water moving at many meters per second. Many meters per second? Those are hurricane speeds. Even at face value, the conditions that these sandstone layers supposedly formed under during the global flood are mutually exclusive, and there's no attempt within the text to reconcile them into a consistent system of ideas. This trend holds true throughout young Earth creationist literature. It's not just a problem with this chapter or this book or the Institute for Creation Research. The ICR flood model, along with most young Earth creationist models, is less of a theory and more a list of segmented explanations for various phenomena with little to no cross-pollination. I can't do science with that. I really can't do anything with that. It makes no predictions about the future, no definitive statements about the past. It doesn't even offer definitions of various natural constructs. And that's problematic because young Earth creationists want to overturn the mainstream paradigm with this model. The lack of corroboration and coverage within young Earth models is even more evident when you consider the breadth of creationist research. All of the young Earth creationist technical literature ever published could fit onto a single bookshelf. So maybe a defender would say creationists just haven't had time to address everything. And it's not inconceivable that a single bookshelf of rich literature could overturn libraries and libraries of faulty knowledge. So is that the case? Does this bookshelf of literature overturn libraries of knowledge that make up our body of scientific knowledge? Well, I don't think so. I want to go into a few reasons why young Earth creationist literature is, well, not very rich. One of the biggest problems with young Earth creationist literature is the way it uses citations. Young Earth creationist literature has a crippling citation problem. One of the biggest culprits is quote mining. Both the fossil record and the global flood use a few out-of-context, unsubstantiated quotes from various experts. This is typical of creationist literature. Quotes that supposedly validate creationist theories are passed around from article to article and book to book, with no regard as to what the quoted person meant, or said later, or actually believes. The justification for this is that saying something against scientific consensus must be brave and sacrificial, while agreeing with other scientists is prejudiced by self-interest or an echo chamber. It's a heads I win, tails you lose scenario that neglects that these quotes were said by real people who can be asked about their intentions and who said the words at certain times in certain places. All of that needs to be considered. By stripping away context and applying a universal assumption of bias, creationists are doing a disservice. Let's take a look at a quote by late scientist Stephen Jay Gould included in the fossil record. Quote, "All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically absent," end quote. Or this quote by zoologist Mark Ridley, quote, "In any case, no real evolutionist, whether a gradualist or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution, as opposed to special creation." Well, I guess that's conclusive, right? The way that these quotes are presented makes it seem like various evolutionists and zoologists are presenting damning evidence against the fossil record. Until you dig deeper. That Mark Ridley quote is from over 4 decades ago. Mark Ridley has written several whole chapters on evolution in the fossil record in a much more recent book of his. So why aren't creationists quoting from those chapters? Or what about the Dr. Gold quote? Well, it's even older, coming from a 1977 Natural History magazine article. Half a century of discoveries post-date that. In the 70s, we had a few specimens from 3 hominin species. Now, we have thousands of specimens from over 20 species. And we're finding a new dinosaur species every week. By ignoring these huge leaps in the field of paleontology and presenting these outdated and overwritten opinions as what these scientists actually believe and what the field and the data actually show, creationists are being dishonest. There's no other way to put it. The creationist citation problem goes much, much deeper than mined quotes. Sticking with the Institute for Creation Research, let's look at one of their articles on continental drift. While speaking about radioisotope dates on seafloor stripes, they postulate, quote, "It is doubtful that magnetic anomalies have been successfully dated," and they provide a source for that. Well, let's look at their source. It's from 1972. In the past 50 years, magnetic anomalies on the seafloor have been successfully dated many, many times. In 1972, they hadn't been, but they have been now. And elsewhere in the article, they cite a source from 1958. That's a decade before the theory of continental drift had even been formally described. Many of the cited scientists were proponents of the expanding Earth hypothesis, which was disproven before the 90s by more accurate data and measurements on a global scale. There wasn't enough to go off in the 50s and 60s, but there is now. And by ignoring the decades and decades, over half a century of research and data that has been collected since then, creationists are, well, at best, wildly misrepresentative of these authors and these citations, and at worst, intellectually dishonest. Do you realize how many thousands of papers and articles ICR had to willfully scroll past to find sources that out of date. But honestly, misrepresented quotes and misused citations are only the tip of the iceberg. The most egregious young Earth creationist use of citations is, well, not using them. For example, when discussing the theory that the Grand Canyon was carved by the Colorado River, the authors of The Global Flood definitively state, quote, perhaps they should be in the Gulf of California in Mexico, where the river enters the ocean, but they aren't there. Some feel they are found in the low-lying deserts near the Salton Sea or offshore San Diego, but this would require water velocities and volumes much greater than normal. ICR is making two claims here. First, they're saying the sediment eroded by the Colorado River from the Grand Canyon and the Colorado Plateau is missing. Second, they're saying even if it was found, the Colorado River doesn't have the velocity or volume of water to move that much sediment. I happen to live a few hours drive from Colorado National Monument. It's a beautiful place. Cliffs of layered rock tower overhead before bending and diving below the ground, with the Colorado River cutting through them. Above the cliffs, at the top of the Colorado Plateau, is the Mancos Shale. At the bottom is the Wingate Sandstone in the Chinle Formation. But if you follow the Colorado River to where it empties out into the Gulf of California, you see something interesting. The rock layers in the Gulf of California contain eroded bits and pieces from the rock layers in the Colorado National Monument, but the order they're in is upside down. The bottommost layers of rock in California have sediment inclusions from the topmost rock layer in Colorado, the Mancos Shale, and in upper layers in California, sediment from the Wingate and Chinle layers can be found. Think of it like licking a lollipop. You can only lick the outside at first, but as you erode inward, you reveal the chocolate center. That's what the Colorado River did as it ran over top the Colorado Plateau. At first, it could only eat away at the outside of the lollipop, the top of the plateau. So the first layers that the Colorado River deposited in California only had particles from the top layer. But as the river dug deeper, it revealed deeper and deeper rock layers, and so eroded sediment from those deeper rock layers started showing up downstream. New rock layers deposited in the Gulf now included sediment from the deeper layers in the Colorado National Monument. The amount of sediment in the Gulf is consistent with how much time it would take the Colorado River to erode into the Grand Mesa. The amount of erosion on the Grand Mesa is consistent with how long it would take for the Colorado River to deposit rock layers in the Gulf of California. The volume of eroded rock missing from the Colorado Plateau matches the volume in the Salton Sea and the Gulf. Now, what I just described directly contradicts what ICR describes in The Global Flood. The only difference is I included citations and they didn't. Honest engagement with the published literature on the subject shows that the observations not only directly disagree with what the authors of The Global Flood state, but they provide a comprehensive mechanism for the change. Are the authors of this book lying, or are they uninformed? It's hard to know, but both problems would have been solved if they properly used citations. Citations make literature better and provide accountability. That's why they exist. Otherwise, ICR can say whatever they want, even when it's explicitly wrong, and unless you had former knowledge on the subject like I do, you'd have no way of checking. Despite non-comprehensive models, poorly cited works, and misrepresentative quotes, I'm not done with creationism just yet. Maybe the low academic standards for creationist literature only serve to disguise good science and sound conclusions. For this next section, I want to investigate creationist methodology and empiricism, and to spread the pain a little bit and not pick on ICR too much, I'm going to analyze Answers in Genesis' work in the field of taxonomy. I'll be drawing mostly from a series of papers written by a team led by Dr. Lightner of Answers in Genesis and published in Answers Research Journal. I'll also be using articles on their website and displays in the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter theme parks. Young Earth creationists reject the taxonomy with which zoologists classify living organisms, in part because that structure is based in evolutionary theory. Young Earth creationists offer an alternative called baraminology. Baraminology divides all species into clades that hover around the taxon family. Some examples for these set forth by creationists are bear kind, equivalent to the family Ursidae, great ape kind, equivalent to family Pongidae, and camel kind, equivalent to family Camelidae. Genuses and species within these kinds can adapt as much as they want, but cannot break out of their kind either in the past or in the future. Theoretically, pairs of ancestors on the ark are responsible for the vast diversity we see within each kind. Dr. Lightner outlines the methodology that she and her team used to divide animals into kinds in the beginning of her report. I'm going to present it as is and let it speak for itself. First, the answers researchers looked for hybridization, reproductive compatibility. If two animals can produce offspring, the researchers considered them, and by extension, their respective taxonomical families, to be the same kind. However, while reproductive compatibility conclusively puts two creatures in the same kind, reproductive incompatibility does not conclusively separate them. Instead, young Earth creationists appeal to cognitum, or humankind's personal divination abilities. Quote, a cognitum is a group of organisms that are naturally grouped together through human cognitive senses. Cognitum. Right. Anticipating what was probably your and my reaction, the researchers explained their, quote, counterintuitive priorities. Quote, one reason the cognitum is the preferred method after hybridization is that Adam would have recognized created kinds by sight. Presumably, the same would have been true in Noah's time. Humans are designed to be able to visually detect patterns and have a natural tendency to group according to those patterns. They continue, hybrid data and statistical baraminology results were in conflict. They explained that data collected by previous researchers was biased towards division. Information bias is a totally reasonable problem to face when doing an empirical study, but the resolution to that problem is hardly to abandon science and resort to what can only be called medium intuition. The researchers doubled down, adding that neither statistical data nor genetic data will be given as high a priority as hybrid data or the cognitum. As one final justification for ignoring genetic groupings, the researchers explained that approaching genetics from a young Earth creationist position raises a glut of speculative questions. Quote, the bottom line is that in light of these questions, we don't have enough understanding of genetics to understand the significance of most sequence data. If your worldview inherently shuts off several valid avenues of scientific inquiry, well, maybe you should reconsider. Regardless, the researchers proceeded with their multi-year process of dividing animals into baraminological kinds anyway. I'm sure you can understand why I have serious problems with this methodology. The outright rejection of statistical data and genetic data is problematic because morphology and genetics still exist whether you recognize them or not. We understand that genetic similarity works in current populations with, say, accurate paternity tests, so at what point in the past did it stop working? There's no evidence for that genetic barrier dividing kinds from each other, and this explanation doesn't address a lot of important factors. Creationists certainly don't have to incorporate these into their theory, but by willfully ignoring them, they're doing bad science. I want to engage one final defense for creationism. Maybe it's not bad science. Maybe, despite the incomplete models, the distressing citation misrepresentation, and the shaky methodology, maybe creationism is consistent with reality. That's a good metric with which to judge a scientific theory, is it not? Does it accurately describe the reality around us? Allow me to introduce you to our last guest of the day, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. Dr. Jeanson is a research associate with both ICR and Answers in Genesis, and a published author. He has a degree in genetics from Harvard, and all in all is a qualified and successful creationist. Over the last 2 years or so, Jeanson has been developing a model which he calls a new history of the human race. Jeanson has been using genetic population mapping to create an alternative model of human history that fits into the creationist timeline. As he describes it, quote, history as you learn in the textbooks tends to be the history of politics. But if you look at the history of peoples, which is the history that DNA records, there's a significant divergence, and so it rewrites who we came from. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. History books, at least when I took history, present these kingdoms as rising, falling, as if they pop into existence out of nowhere and disappear without a trace. I love history. I'm not sure when Dr. Jeanson took history, but when I did, we learned about all sorts of people groups that surrounded the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Persians. We learned about like the Etruscans or the Minoans, and I think it's a bit of a straw man to represent history textbooks as saying these kingdoms popped in and out of existence. But straw man or not, either way, some of Dr. Jeanson's conclusions are troubling. Using his supposed genetic data, Jansen has concluded that human history is much different than the history books tell us. Jansen believes there's no such thing as indigenous Europeans. Rather, most Europeans are descended from Central Asian and African nomads that migrated to Europe around 1000 AD. He describes these immigrants as, quote, black white people who are genetically black but appear ethnically white. He also believes that nations did not become ethnically distinct until very recently. For example, he claims that Finnish, Peruvian, Pakistani, British, and Spanish ethnicities were all one ethnic group until more recently than 1500 AD. Further, Jansen believes that Pacific Islanders colonized America first. Then, around the time of Christ, Middle Easterners crossed the ocean and conquered the Mayans and Olmecs before becoming the Native Americans. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory anymore. Answers in Genesis did a 30-plus hour series where Dr. Jansen's co-host was Ken Ham. This is why I don't think the trajectory of modern creationism is tenable. Far from coming closer to overturning the paradigm, creationists are they're distancing themselves further from the evidence, further from cohesiveness, further from reality, further from the truth, and simultaneously they're digging their heels in deeper and shouting from the rooftop, we have answers. They're binding their theories and insane hypotheses. They're tying them to scriptural biblical truth. And that's dangerous. Instead of shunning and laughing out these proposals like Dr. Jansen's, instead we see him and Ken Ham preaching them to their audience for dozens of hours. This will reach a critical point. This will go critical. So many creationist theories from the past 20 years are in the same realm as Dr. Jansen. Just think about how many creationist theories involve some kind of sped up past. We have faster starlight from distant stars. We have faster tectonic plate movement. We have faster nuclear decay. We have faster speciation after the ark. We have faster ethnic diversity after the Tower of Babel. And how long until these incredible theories collapse? Like how long until people look at these and say, well, if we have to speed everything up, what if all this stuff just took a long time? By driving these ungrounded theories forward and tying them to a premise of scriptural reality, young earth creationists are setting themselves up to not only be irrelevant, but to be wrong, to be really wrong. And that's bad. For the last segment of this video, I won't be discussing the science surrounding young earth creationism, but the ethics surrounding young earth creationism. The scientific community strives to be honest. I don't think most people disagree with that statement. I think even young earth creationists understand that. But there's a problem. For years, the scientific community has used a series of rules called academic integrity or research integrity. These are to ensure that scientists remain intellectually honest, i.e., not saying things that they don't know are factual and not withholding facts that they know are important. Using citations correctly, submitting to peer review, and reporting conflicts of interest are all methods for this. Their importance should be self-evident. Otherwise, anyone can say anything without accountability. But more intrinsically, scientists don't deal in proof or truth because science can't speak to proof or truth. Science deals in facts and evidence, both of which are subject to change with new information or new interpretation. For years, young earth creationists have readily violated both of these pillars of scientific honesty. Not only does their work lack integrity, but they are binding their model of spiritual truth. Creationist organizations are unequivocally saying, from a place of spiritual authority, that creationist theories are true. And worse, they're selling that from a place of authority. These last few months, Answers in Genesis raised $17 million in an end-of-year fundraising event. When you publish research, you have a duty to know that it was written with integrity. When you sell research, that duty increases tenfold, especially when you sell to the tune of $17 million. Either creationists don't know that their work falls short, or they do know. I don't know which one's worse. This is not about ideology. I'm a Christian. I'm not anti-creationist. I encourage scientists and laymen alike to question the paradigm. That's how science progresses. If we knew everything right now, we'd stop doing science. But here's the thing. If creationists continue to go the way they're going, they're not going to accomplish anything. They're not going to overturn the paradigm. They're not going to prove the Bible. Because in the long run, the lack of integrity is only going to drive Christians away from creationism, and worse, it's going to drive them away from the faith. Young Earth creationism is headed towards a collapse, and I'm really worried about that. Thank you.